Hi there. Welcome to the second webinar in our MyTax Canadian Joint Venture Human Dimensions webinar series. In this webinar, Katie and I are going to discuss some of the fundamentals of human dimensions, and in particular, we're going to focus on values. Begs the question, of course, what are values? And certainly there are a number of different ways to think about values, to conceive of values, and to approach this concept of values. In this webinar, we're going to focus on economic valuation methods, different ways that we can ascribe economic value to things, to natural resources, perhaps to ecosystem services. But we're also going to be examining values from a social psychological perspective. And we're doing that partly because when we're engaging with people, when we're engaging with the public, when we're engaging with bird watchers or waterfowl hunters, we're engaging with individuals, but we're also engaging with groups of people. So understanding how people are conceiving of value in groups, but also as individuals, will be pretty important for our work as we try to understand why people do the things that they do, or why people aren't doing the things that we would like them to do. So a lot of the work, a lot of the context that we use to think about value, certainly in the Canadian context, come from early work around forestry and the forest values, or those values that people have towards forests. And the work of Bonnie McFarlane and Peter Boxall back in the late 90s informs a lot of this work. So when we think about values from a social psychological perspective, we can use this sort of definition or description. Values are culturally and emotionally informed beliefs about desirable and appropriate actions for judging other people's or actions and goals in other contexts. So a couple of important things here. They're emotionally informed beliefs. They're also about things that are desirable or appropriate. So again, these are expressions of those values. Boxall and McFarlane talk about forest values as those general beliefs in relation to forests, that forest values represent an individual's orientation towards forests, and that forest values are relatively enduring conceptions of the good related to forests and to forest ecosystems. Now, again, we're seeing a lot of these expressions about general beliefs representing orientations towards forests. So really, it is about people's relationships, in this case with forests, what drives those interactions, and what they're seeking in those interactions, both in terms of expressing what they believe to be desirable and appropriate, but also what they're supporting in terms of perhaps management approaches that they deem to be desirable and appropriate. Now, McFarlane and Boxall were working in this context of forests and forestry, and we're working in a different context. We're working with wetlands and we're working with waterfowl predominantly, although we do work with other habitats, upland areas, for example. We do work with forests too. We also are concerned with other birds too. So we might look at some of these forest values and think of them somewhat differently, as in a wetland context, for example, those general beliefs people have about wetlands, relatively enduring conceptions of those goods related to wetlands and wetland ecosystems. So here we're really having a focus on the thing that's important to us in the NAWAMP context. So we've seen this diagram of the cognitive hierarchy before. Certainly if you've had any interactions with me, you've had an opportunity to look at this. And I think this is a nice way of thinking about the role of values in behaviors. And ultimately, I would suggest we are concerned with people's behaviors, be they behaviors of people who are conservationally minded and have interactions with wetlands and waterfowls or upland areas and forests with those bird species that we're concerned with. We're also concerned with those behaviors of landowners with respect to how they are managing their lands, managing wetlands on their properties. Do they plow them over to be a bit more efficient in terms of what they're harvesting, whatever that crop is? Or do they take care to maintain that wetland? And there's a variety of reasons why a person might choose to do either option. We're suggesting here that focusing on understanding people's values helps us understand how those values are expressed as behaviors. Certainly when we think about the relationship between values and behaviors, we can see with this diagram that the influence of values on behaviors is indirect. We have to think about these basic belief patterns, the attitudes that we form, as well as the attitudes of the communities or societies that we live in, those norms. We can think about these ideas of behavioral intentions, things that we would like to do, behaviors or responses that we would like to have, and ultimately those behaviors that we do engage in. When we think about these values, I've said in the past that values are relatively few in number. They're fundamental to many of the things that we do as people. And these values are slow to change. They're often formed early in life, through parents, through family, through close friends, and they become reinforced in terms of what is good and bad, what we believe to be righteous, what we believe to be desirable and appropriate. But I think when I've talked about values in the past and saying they're relatively few in number, I've given the impression that we maybe only have a handful of those, and that's not necessarily true, as we'll see later on in this webinar. We can think about these basic belief patterns or value orientations as being sort of bundles of values that are consistent with one another. These basic belief patterns will be kind of few in number. Swartz suggests that there might be 10 of these. Rokesh suggests that there's 36 of these value orientations. And these value orientations really depends on the context that we're working in. Just like values, these value orientations are stable, and they tend to be widely shared and are supported within communities and societies. Perhaps an example of basic belief patterns or value orientations that you may have come across would be from the work of Michael Manfredo. Now, Manfredo and his colleagues have worked to develop value orientations as they relate to wildlife. And he's created a wildlife values orientation scale, which helps us understand about what people are thinking about wildlife as a precursor to some of the attitudes they have about wildlife. So we might have come across some of these examples before. Now, certainly the role that experience plays has an effect on every layer or every sort of dimension of this cognitive hierarchy. The context really matters. And in fact, often it's the context that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out and sort out in order to really understand what those behaviors mean, because that context really matters. So often when we talk about value, people think about or seem to go right away to this idea of economic value. And certainly economic values are an expression of values, those things that we deem to be important. And things that we deem to be really important generally have a higher value or a higher cost. And yes, this has a lot to do with supply and demand, and I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of that. But I think at the root of it, economic value and the values from a social psychological perspective aren't really all that different. They really are trying to identify those things that we deem to be important. Now, economics puts a dollar value on that. Social psychologists might put a scale number on that. Different ways of doing it. But here, when we're thinking about economic valuation methods, we really are thinking about the benefits or the utility that people receive or accrue from various interactions. So let's look at this sort of typology of values from Sarker and Kenny. And again, they were looking at this really from a forestry perspective, different ways you might economically value forest products or those things coming from forests. So let's start off with value, have a pretty good sense of what that is. And in an economic perspective, we can think of market value and non-market values. Now, non-market values are those things that aren't actively traded in markets, those things that don't have a price tag on them per se. Whereas market values are those things that we do actively buy and sell, that do have prices or costs associated with them. And those costs, those prices are known. So when we think about market values, we can think about a bunch of different things. But again, those market values will be those things that are actively traded in markets, those things that do have a price, and that price is really concerned with supply and demand. Now, I'm simplifying things a lot, and if there's any economists out there, I'm imagining there's a lot of furrowed brows, and I have oversimplified things. But that's an important distinction. The cost is sort of accepted or it's not. Now, non-market values are different because we don't necessarily actively trade these things, buy or sell them. And when we think of non-market values, we can think of them as composed of being two types, use values and non-use values. So when we think about use values, for example, we can think of two kinds. These are things that we're actively engaging with, for one. So that's one distinction we need to think about between use values and non-use values. But when we think about use values, those things that we're actively using or interacting with, we have those values that might be consumed, and we also have those things that have a non-consumptive value. And again, in a forestry context, let's think about what some of these might be. Well, if we think about consumptive value, those would be things that we would be removing from a system. So tree fiber would be one of those use values where we go and harvest trees for their timber, for that fiber, to build things, or to make paper, or to create biofuels. There's lots of things that we can do with that wood fiber, but we're using it, we're taking it from the system, so it's consumed, it's a consumptive value. We can also think of things like hunting and fishing as having a consumptive value. Again, we'd be removing fish or removing wildlife from the ecosystem for our use. And we're using those things. Now, certainly, animal meat might be traded in markets. Not in Canada, not in North America for sure, but in other places it could be. And some economists have tried to equate an economic value to wild meat, using comparisons to non-wild meat that we would normally buy in our supermarkets. So there might be some ways of ascribing value in that sense to fish or other wildlife if we wanted to, although in the North American model we do tend to shy away from that. We also have non-consumptive values, again, but things where we're actively engaged or immersed in these places. So we can think of recreation activities like hiking or bird watching, for example, where we're not actively taking anything out of the system, but we're immersed in those natural systems and we're getting some benefits from those, some utility from those things. We're feeling better, perhaps. We're getting that physical activity, which is ultimately good for our bodies and those sorts of things. But we can also think of a non-consumptive value as an economic output. Think of tourism, for example. Even if we just focus on natural areas tourism or ecotourism, it's an economic activity for sure. And we're able to sort of sort those benefits and utilities out. So those would be some examples of non-consumptive values. Those recreation activities perhaps, or those tourism activities that don't remove anything from the system. So let's put those together, and let's now think about non-use values. And these are, maybe we're verging on the philosophical here, but these would be those things that aren't actively traded in markets and things that we don't actively engage in, yet they still bring us benefits and utility. So I'm just going to talk about four. There are different ways of thinking about these. And again, these are valuation methods. These are sort of examples of things that economists have come up with ways to ascribe value to. So here we can think about existence value, option values, vicarious values, and bequest values. Now these are things that we, again, don't have these sort of first-person interactions with, but we're still deriving benefits from or utility from. So let's think about existence value. Those would be sort of the values that we have about places that we're never going to actually go to and visit, but it brings us some sort of benefit or utility just knowing that it's there. So I'm a rock climber, not as active as I used to be, but I'm a rock climber, and from an early age I've always been fascinated by tall mountains, in particular the Himalayas. Now, I've never had an opportunity to go to Everest or K2, and I don't suspect I will if I'm being honest, but it does bring me some satisfaction, some joy, it sort of fuels my curiosity to know that Everest and K2 are there. So just the fact that those places exist, I'm deriving benefit from that in terms of my curiosity, the thoughts that I have, and the joy that I get about knowing that those places are there, that there are these really tall, challenging places where in a recreation context or a mountaineering context, people can kind of test their skills with the challenges of nature. We also have an option value, and option values are a little bit different, with the idea that we may have a potential use for that resource, for that particular thing in the future. We're not using it now, but we think we might want to use that particular resource in the future, either consumptively or non-consumptively. But just knowing that it's a possibility for the future has some utility to that. We call that utility an option value. A third kind of non-use value would be a vicarious value. And we think about vicarious values are those sort of benefits and utilities we get through sort of third-party accounts about particular places. So thinking back to my Himalayas example, the K2 and the Everest, places that I don't think I'm going to get to, I have spent many an afternoon and late in the evening reading accounts of mountaineers in K2 and on Everest, and looking at pictures and seeing movies, really having a connection to that place through the experience of others. And again, not something that I've experienced personally, but I'm able to kind of experience through the eyes or the lenses of others. And that brings me some, again, utility or benefit. Helps me think about, well, if I am ever going to get there, what are some of the things I start to need to be thinking about? So it's fueling my curiosity, it's helping me be creative, and quite honestly, it's a nice escape for me. After a day at the office, I can go and I can read about, someone's trials and tribulations of hiking up Everest or mountaineering, climbing up Everest. Lastly, we have bequest values. And bequest values would be the benefit or utility that we would get from passing on a resource to somebody else. Future generations, perhaps, or perhaps someone that we know in particular. But again, it's not something we're actively using now, but by giving others the opportunity to have that in the future, similar to an option value, it does bring us benefit and utility. And we're receiving these benefits and utilities from, in this case, I've been using forestry examples, but again, we could think about this in terms of wetlands, waterfowl, upland game birds, and other ecosystems that we're concerned with. We can bunch those together as well. So right now, I'd really like to return to this idea of forest values that McFarlane and Boxall talked about in the late 90s in some of those earlier slides. And we can see that there's an alignment here with some of these economic valuation methods. So we have our forest values, again, those things that people think are desirable about forests. Again, the focus is on a particular ecosystem or a particular ecosystem element here. And it's that benefit that would accrue from that. And here we're looking at instrumental values. We can also think about these instrumental as also being sort of anthropocentric or human-centered things. Human-centered values, human-centered expressions of those things we deem to be important. We also have non-instrumental values in this forest context. We might think of those things as being more biocentric or biocentered, not necessarily having people at the center of things, but thinking about things more holistically. So when we think about these economic or anthropocentric values, these are very much those use values we saw in that previous slide. We're looking at sort of those economic values or those utilitarian values, things that are bringing us benefit. And again, very much focused on the benefits that people receive from these things. So we can think about these economic or utilitarian values as being those sort of market values, but we also have those life support or ecosystem function of forests. We can think of those now generally as ecosystems, goods, and services, but we're able to, for some of those, to put a dollar amount on those, like carbon sequestration, for example. Putting a price on carbon may provide a framework for addressing climate change. or at least reduction of emissions and their contribution to climate change. But that ability or that desire to put a number, a dollar value on those, on that ability to sequester carbon, has really unlocked some policy options. So economics does play an important role here, and I don't want to diminish that. We can also think of some of the other benefits from ecosystem goods and services. Let's think about some of those from wetlands, for example, like carbon sequestration for sure, but also flood abatement. Wetlands are able to provide some of that protection at various times of years. So, again, and the Insurance Bureau of Canada is looking at things like flood protection, the value of wetlands in and around urban areas, for example, to try and decrease the payouts that they're making. They're recognizing that these ecosystem services do have an important function from an insurance perspective, but really it's about the contributions and benefits of these ecosystems, goods and services to people. And there's some recognition of that, and that's really interesting to watch. We also have these non-instrumental values, and these are non-use values for sure, and they are a bit more elusive, a bit more sort of fuzzy to kind of identify. So we have spiritual values, and if we think about forests or wetlands, this would be sort of those benefits that we get to our spiritual side. It might be things like inspiration. It might be this recognition that being in a place, an ecosystem, is far more complex and larger than ourselves, and somehow that helps our spirit. It helps us identify our place in the universe, and there might be some solace in that. There might be some benefit we receive from that. We might think about sort of the inherent rights or worth of nature. Now, this is sort of more of a philosophical perspective for sure, and it sort of rides on these ideas about who or what have value in a system or have agency in a particular system. And it has a lot to do with our philosophical perspectives about the role of people in the world, in ecosystems. Are we part of nature or are we separate from nature? Those sorts of ideas. We also have existence values, which we touched on that previous slide, and then we also have aesthetic values for sure. If you think about the Group of Seven and the inspiration that they were able to draw from Canadian landscapes, Tom Thompson's Northern Ontario spruce bog paintings, very inspirational, and not just in art, but in music and in narrative and in story as well. These cultural benefits that we get from ecosystems, be they forests or other places, they're really important. But again, these are things that aren't actively used necessarily. But the distinction here is that these values, these non-instrumental values, don't always have people at the center of things. There's this recognition, perhaps, that there are other beings, other systems, other processes that might be having some benefits from these. So that kind of finishes off the sort of this introduction to different conceptions of value. And now I'm going to pass things off to Katie, who's going to be introducing Swartz's basic values and talk about value structures. Take it away, Katie.
So when we start to think practically about how values influence other elements of the bottom half of the cognitive hierarchy, Thomas Haberlein, who's an attitude expert, turns to Aldo Leopold for an illustration. So you may be aware that Leopold bought a plot of land in Wisconsin in the 1930s and started to practice restoration ecology. For years, he and his family planted white pines. It took several seasons for any to take, and the ones that did eventually take became shaded by red birch. And there's an essay in a Sand County almanac where Leopold recounts his reflections one day, some 12 years after he started planting pines, as he's standing axe in hand preparing to cut down some birch trees. And what he says is, "I find it disconcerting to analyse, ex post facto, the reasons behind my own axe in hand questions. I find, first of all, that not all trees are created free and equal. Where a white pine and a red birch are crowding each other, I have an a priori bias. I always cut the birch to favour the pine. Why? Well, first of all, I planted the pine with my shovel. whereas the birch crawled in under the fence and planted itself. My bias is thus to some extent paternal. So when Leopold is talking about bias in that quote, he's really referring to what psychologists would call values or motivational values. And he's identified paternalism as the value or a value that might be causing his behaviour. Other psychologists might call this family security instead of paternalism. But sticking to Leopold's language, paternalism is something that he might feel towards many things. So his children, his writing, just as we might also have similar values of paternalism towards things that we value. And this is one of the distinctions between values and attitudes. Values are not focused on a particular object, whereas attitudes always have an object. So this table illustrates two components of value orientations that link values to attitudes. So beliefs and evaluative beliefs. So beliefs, in this case, the fact that Leopold planted the pine himself and the birch planted itself, are cognitions, or what we believe to be true. They're always tied to an object, and they're always free of emotion. So one person might love pines, another might hate them, but both can agree that Leopold planted the pines and not the birches. And then evaluative beliefs are what you get when you tie a value to a belief. And these suggest that one thing is better than another. So in this example, paternalism, so pride in what Leopold produced, means that he sees the trees that he planted himself as being better than those that were self-seeded. And it's evaluative beliefs, so the addition of values to beliefs, that create the emotional element in attitudes. Leopold says, "The only conclusion I have ever reached is that I love all trees, but I am in love with pines." He doesn't just like them, he loves them. In fact, he died fighting a fire that threatened these pines some 6 months after the essay was written. The emotional aspect of attitudes towards something is something that we feel physically. So if you encounter something that you love, it might generate a warm fuzzy feeling inside, your heart might beat faster, your cheeks might flush, and so on. And when we have strong emotions about things, we have stronger attitudes towards them. And it's this emotional aspect of attitudes that makes them tricky, because it's fundamentally irrational and so not subject to reason. And it's often emotions that perpetuate conflicts. People aren't necessarily arguing over the facts or the beliefs, but the values that they apply to them. So for example, when we think about the kind of current mask wearing narratives that are in the press, the discussion is less about the extent to which masks do or don't prevent COVID-19 transmission, and more about conflicting values of freedom versus social responsibility. So this strong emotion causes strong attitudes, and one of the other results of that is that you can provide people with facts to try and change their beliefs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll change their attitude or behaviour towards it. So one of the nice things about this essay is that it's a textbook articulation of all of the values that Leopold holds with regards to pines. And what this table shows is that he goes on to explain, as well as paternalism and family security, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 values in total that contribute towards his feelings towards pines. And it shows really nicely how multiple values and belief systems create an attitude. And this is what psychologists call a horizontal structure. The more values you have that contribute towards your attitude towards something, the more stable and strong your attitude is likely to be. And obviously not everybody has such a strongly developed attitude towards pines as Leopold, and so our horizontal structures might not be so wide and our attitude might be less consistent. And although Leopold had this particularly strongly structured attitude towards pines, he might not have the same extent of development in his attitudes towards other things. So just to explain some of the values that Leopold articulated, he says, "The birch is an abundant tree in my township and becoming more so, whereas pine is scarce and becoming scarcer. Perhaps my bias is for the underdog. So this is the equality or underdog bias. And this leads him to the evaluative belief that it's better to help trees that are less abundant. He also says the pine will live for a century, but the birch for half of that. Do I fear that my signature will fade? And so here he's talking about a sense of accomplishment, that it's better for him to take care of longer living trees. Pines are longer living, and therefore that contributes towards his strength of feeling towards them. My neighbours have planted no pines at all, but have many birches. Am I snobbish about having a woodlot of distinction? So here he's talking about a social recognition value. His neighbours don't have any pines, his neighbours have many birches, and so him having a woodlot with pines makes it better than his neighbours. The pine stays green all winter, the birch punches the clock in October. Do I favour the tree that, like myself, braves the winter wind? The pine will shelter a grouse, but the birch will feed him. Do I consider a bed more important than board? The pine will ultimately bring $10 a thousand, the birch $2. Have I an eye on the bank? And in his book, Heberlein draws out the distinctions between the values really nicely, and has created this table that provides us with the illustration and understanding of Leopold's values. One of the things that this shows as well is that changing attitude is difficult when multiple belief systems are involved. So, for example, Leopold just mentioned financial security or a comfortable life as a motivating value for favouring pines. So you might think, well, if I want to change his attitude, I could try and approach it from an economic point of view, somehow convincing that he's got his pricing estimates wrong, or implement some kind of instrument to the market to improve the value of birch. However, it's unlikely that we would change his attitude towards pines in that way, because financial security is just one element of his belief system. And another reason that addressing his financial security is unlikely to change his mind is that not all values are held equally. In fact, what Leopold says is, all of these possible reasons for my bias seem to carry some weight, but none of them carries very much. So I try again, and here perhaps is something. Under this pine will ultimately grow a trailing arbutus, an Indian pipe, a pyrola, or a twin flower, whereas under the birch a bottle gentian is about the best to be hoped for. In this pine a pileated woodpecker will ultimately chisel out a nest. In the birch a hairy will have to suffice. In this pine the wind will sing for me in April, at which time the birch is only rattling naked twigs. These possible reasons for my bias carry weight, but why? Does the pine stimulate my imagination and my hopes more deeply than the birch does? If so, is the difference in the trees or in me? And in this excerpt he is referring to values like world of beauty and stimulation. And as someone who spent their life in forestry and close to nature, what Heberlein suggests is that these values are much closer to Leopold's identity, in terms of who he is, than the others that he's mentioned before. And so it's not surprising that these two values really resonate with him as the source of his emotional feelings towards pine trees. And what that kind of tells us is that values that are more central to our identity are more likely to be both emotional but also difficult to change. Although it's possible that we might change our identities and our roles, and then our attitudes might change along with them. And the other thing that this illustrates to us is that we might share the same fundamental values as others, but emphasise them differently. Perhaps a sense of accomplishment or social recognition is more important to my sense of identity, and so I might share the same values as Leopold, but emphasise them differently. And the other point that's important to note is that context plays a role in which values are more central to us at different points in our lives. So a life change, perhaps having a child, might increase the importance of family security or wealth-based values at that point in our lives. So to summarise then, values aren't typically focused on, or are not focused on, a particular object, whereas attitudes are always about an object. Beliefs are what we believe to be true about an object. They're not emotional. Someone might love pines, another might hate them, but both can agree that Leopold planted them. Evaluative beliefs are what you get when you combine values and beliefs, and that adds emotion to attitudes. A stronger emotion leads to a stronger, more consistent attitude. Multiple values and belief systems create an attitude. Greater horizontal structure leads to more consistent attitudes. Not all values are equal to us. Some are more central to our identity, and those tend to be more emotion-filled. We might share the same values as others, but choose to emphasise them differently. And context is important. So we understand now that there are relatively few values, but that we combine multiple values with our factual beliefs and emotions to create attitudes. And a lot of research has been done by psychologists to try and identify what the values are and create a structure or a model for understanding them. So in the 1970s, a researcher called Rokesh pioneered research into 36 foundational values, and this work is really kind of the starting point for much of the work on values that we see today. And then Swartz built on this work by creating a model of motivational values that you see here on the slide. And his model contains 10 value types, which fall under 4 different dimensions. So self-transcendence, openness to change, self-enhancement, and conservation, which is more around kind of preserving the status quo than conservation in biological terms as we might think of it. And he tested his model on people in countries across the world with collaborators in order to validate it and also understand the sub-values that might contribute to the 10 categories or types that he'd identified. So in the next slide, we're going to focus in more on the value types, but the model is presented at a slightly different orientation to what we've seen so far. So it might be upside down to what you would have expected. So what we can see here is that under each of the 10 types, there are multiple sub-values. So under power, there are things like authority, wealth, social power, social recognition, and these are expressions of the value power. Similarly, so under tradition, we've got expressions like accepting my portion in life, moderate, respect for tradition, devout, detachment, humility. And what we went on to do next in the seminar is just to think in terms of a rather basic example. So greed was something that Pierre had asked questions about in the last seminar, and that was really useful for Howie and I because it sort of started to provoke our thoughts about, well, how do we define greed and how can we think about greed in value terms? So in my more limited experience of Halloween, I have 2 dogs, and so we certainly don't go out trick-or-treating with them, but what we do find is that when people knock on the door, it really upsets them. So, and it happened, well, on Halloween particularly, because people kind of knock over and over again. So our compromise is to put a bucket out on the doorstep and put candy in it and let people help themselves. But what we have found is that there's always one child that comes along and takes the lot for themselves. And so what we wanted to do is think about, okay, well, why might someone be motivated to steal all the candy and prevent others from having it? And how can we think about this in terms of the values or the expressions of value that might contribute to that? And what Howie and I thought, and actually as a group overall during the webinar, everybody came up with similar items, was that the green areas are the things you might typically associate with somebody taking all the sweets. So things like social recognition, it might be a cool thing to do. It might be a sign of achievement, so of success. Maybe it's appealing to a hedonistic value where someone just likes to enjoy life and have pleasure and not worry about anything else. Maybe it's stimulating because it's daring and exciting. Maybe it's about self-direction, so choosing your own goals or demonstrating your independence. But equally, the blue circles are also values or that might explain why you would do that are perhaps less obvious. So, for example, a sense of belonging. You know, there are other kids that do this and you want to join in and be part of it too. Maybe you're being honest about who you are. or you think you're being helpful. So the people coming behind you and up the street are diabetics, and they can't have any of these anyway. So rather than make them feel sad that they can't have these particular sweets, you're going to take them all and help them out. Maybe it's about equality. You're actually taking them all to hand them out to friends who you know aren't allowed to go trick-or-treating. Or perhaps stimulated by social justice, the child that lives in the house with all the sweets bullies others at school, and it's your way of getting back at them. And then there are obviously some other values which really don't align with the idea of taking all the sweets. So accepting my portion in life, or self-discipline, politeness, or perhaps healthy values, are not the kind of things that are likely to motivate you to take all the candy. And so, having discussed this relatively childish example, we then moved on to think about values and why they might explain why people drain wetlands for agriculture. And as a group, these are the areas that we thought about. So, wealth, preserving a public image, but also things like respect for tradition, so this is the way the family's always done it, or respect for elders, so other people in the community think it's important, and so we should adhere to that. So being about tradition and conformity. There's also an aspect of family security, maximising the amount of land available for farming, or cleanliness, because wetlands might be seen to be dirty. It might also be motivated by the idea of a world of beauty, having straight rows not interrupted by potholes. It might also be an expression of independence or freedom, daring, doing what you want to do, just living the life the way you want to live it. And it might also be stimulated by attitudes or values that relate to achievement, so being ambitious, successful, or capable. This might all indicate those three things.
Thanks, Katie. So I think by now we have a better idea about, values, value orientations are those sort of basic belief patterns, as well as value structure, different ways we might express these particular values. And we've talked about how those might relate to different contexts, be they wetlands or forests or Halloween candy. And here we are again back at the cognitive hierarchy, and I think this is really important. And I'd like to finish off with some reflections by Peter Boxall and Bonnie McFarlane. And just a reminder, they were working at a time in Canada when forestry really had a lens on it. People were really paying close attention to forestry. It had a lot to do with sustainable forest management and the real development of that sort of management paradigm with respect to forests. It had a lot to do with forest certification, this sort of third party mechanism to test, I suppose, and to verify that forest management was being done in a sustainable manner. And this was a game changer in the Canadian forestry sector for sure. And it also sort of had a lot to do with the rise of international groups like the Forest Stewardship Council, for example, and their influence in terms of how forestry is practiced around the globe. So with that in mind, sort of this tumult in the forest industry, thinking about those sorts of issues, those things that they didn't normally or didn't usually have to do. And a lot of this had to do with social and cultural values, things we would call today human dimensions. So here's a quote from Boxall and McFarlane, or McFarlane and Boxall. It's important to understand these value-attitude relationships and the factors influencing values and attitudes, because attitudes, in turn, are likely to affect individual consumer behavior, such as the purchasing of green certified wood products, and political action, like the blockading of forestry operations. And these may impact forest policy and management. So again, McFarlane and Boxall are referring to this green certification process, certified wood, as well as actions that people were taking. Remember, Clayoquot Sound, the largest civil disobedience action in Canada, the largest mass arrest in Canada, was around people trying to protect old-growth forests. And that did have a policy effect. So values do matter. We do need to understand values and their indirect influence on people's behaviors. It does influence what we do from a policy perspective, from a programmatic perspective. And it also has an influence in how we interact with different stakeholder groups. And within the NAWAMP enterprise, we are seeking to engage with more people. We want to grow the number of people who are concerned with the conservation of wetlands, uplands, other ecosystems as well. And I think that's really important to remember. So that's why we're focusing on values. Again, we may not have a lot of influence on values from the seats that we have around the NAWAMP table, but we're definitely concerned with people's behaviors. So understanding people's values might give us some clues to why people are engaging in certain behaviors, but it also may give us some tools we can use to try and change that behavior as well by appealing to their values. So to wrap things up, here's some final thoughts about values. I think we really need to be clear about what we mean when we use the word values. What type or types of values are we interested in? Is it an economic value? Is it a non-instrumental value? Is it a social psychological value? Or is it more of a philosophical value in terms of what's good and wrong, good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil? So we need to be able to agree on how we're using the term values within our own joint ventures, but within this larger Canadian joint venture group, so that we all kind of know what we're talking about. We need to agree, because that ultimately helps us understand the perspectives that we're using, the perspectives that where we're coming from. We also need to remember that values are concepts. These are abstract ideas that reside in our heads. And I think the challenge for us, or one of the challenges for us, is going to come in the development of our national survey. We need to be able to connect these abstract ideas of values, not just those things that our stakeholders and the public deem to be important, but also those ideas, those elements, those things that we and the NAWAMP community believe to be important and worthwhile and desirable. And how we can connect those abstract values to things that can be measured and or observed. Now, theory will have a role in helping us do this, to structure not just that theory, but help us connect abstract theory to sort of concrete measurement. So we're going to be spending some time on theory in some upcoming seminars. But again, this is really just as a tool to help us explain some of those connections between abstract ideas and concrete things. And I want to finish off here. Although values are difficult to change, understanding them is critical, as they have this indirect influence on attitudes and ultimately behaviors. So that's why it's important to understand and know values. But it's also important to remember that values aren't the only influence on behaviors. That context, those experiences that individuals have, play roles too. And understanding what that context is just as important, I would argue, as understanding values. I would suggest too that maybe we have a better understanding, or a bit more familiar and comfortable understanding context than we are with values, because values are rather challenging. They may be somewhat fuzzy to understand. So by focusing on values, we're trying to sort of shore up our skill set and shore up sort of our sharpening our pencils, I guess I'll say, in terms of some of the things we're going to have to do to engage members of the public, to engage other conservationists in this journey that we have to maintain, support, and ultimately conserve wetlands, uplands, forested areas, and the birds that depend on them. Thanks for sticking with us this far. See you at the next one.